Hey everyone, Sean Frangella here with a new After Effects video about my top 5 tips for working with 3D cameras inside of After Effects. So in After Effects, working with cameras is one of the most powerful things you can do because you can mimic camera movement and animation like you could in real life, as well as adjust camera properties and mimic things like depth of field and focal length, as well as do a couple things that would be really difficult to pull off in live action production because we're working with computers, so we can link some stuff together in really clever ways and control things in ways that would be really difficult or expensive to pull off in live action production. So let's get started with the list. Camera tip number 1, changing our default focal length. So here I have this scene with some text and a couple lights set up in 3D, and if I delete the camera, this is basically what we're looking at head on. And if I create a new camera by going to Layer, New Camera, or pressing Shift Command Option C, basically all the buttons you can think of and see, the default focal length is 50 millimeters, and if I put that in my scene, everything looks the same. And that's fine for just doing kind of camera animation. But if we work that the same way we can with real cameras, we can change what our image looks like and distort and bend the perspective. And what I mean by that is, say that this is our normal 50 millimeter. So the world is gonna look accurately displayed as it would without a camera. If I go to camera settings, I can still change this, and these presets mimic lenses of real cameras. So if I go to something really small, it's gonna look like I moved away, but I'm actually getting kind of a fisheye look, and I can swing around in front of my text and really see that this small focal length, so right now we're on 15, is impacting how our image looks and how the space is displayed. And even though we only have 2D layers in After Effects in this case, it can really go a long way with creating some interesting images. And on the other end, if it was something like a 200 millimeter lens, then we're mimicking a telephoto lens, so it's gonna look like it's punched in. And even though the camera is way over here, if I pan out by using C, which are these tools, or I can click through the camera tools with C, we can see that even though those layers are in the back and further back in space, so here's my text layers here, it looks compressed. So what I typically like to do with 2D motion graphics is, if I want them to look big and heroic, I go with something like a 15 millimeter lens, and then we get this cool distortion fisheye look, which can be really nice for motion graphics and make them look really big and text look really heroic and nice. Camera tip number 2, controlling rotation with a null object. So in my scene, I'll just reset this and create a new camera. And if we're using a 2-node camera, what this is gonna do, if I press OK, is give us, under transform, a position and point of interest. So where the camera is that we can move and what it's looking at. And if we animate both of those by turning on a keyframe and then go ahead and move the camera around in my viewports, that's going to animate between the camera. So we could create camera motion like this, and that's sometimes a great way to do it. However, a really useful tip is if I just get my camera kind of in my basic point where I want it, so maybe that's my end frame. Say that this is our end position, so we'll put keyframes, and we want to start the camera over here and have it looking at the text. So we could do those keyframes and then grab our Bezier curves down here and kind of roughly animate this. However, a clever thing we can do is, again, I'll just delete these. Rather than that, what we can do is make a null. So I'll go to Layer, New, Null Object, and call this Camera Null. Make it a 3D layer. And since this is sitting at a different point in our scene, if we parent our camera to that camera null, and then I'll press R to get rotation, now we can rotate that camera null around, and it's going to swing our camera exactly around in a circle from this point. And the camera is always going to be looking at this. And to go one step further, this is useful because say we first do this rotation, so I'll turn on keyframes for Y rotation. This is our ending frame. And at the beginning, we'll swing it around so it's at something like 80. That's all nice, and it's going to be smooth, and we're getting exactly 80 degrees over 2 seconds, so we know that it's exact, and this curve is following exactly. But now that we have that going, to have a little more control rather than animating everything on the camera like I mentioned a minute ago, we have that rotation null going. Now if we animate just the position of the camera, so say it starts out further back and lower to the ground, Now if I keyframe that position and then go to the end, it's keyframing the position from the null. So I'm going to get the rotation independently. And in addition to that, I can have the position changing a bit and say, to make more of a point, it starts really close and then tracks back. We're going to get that rotation happening. And in addition to that, it's going to track back over the same amount of time. So if I ease both of these in, so I'll just do keyframe assistant, easy ease in. Now we get that rotation, and at the same time, this camera is pulling back and tracking back while always maintaining the direction of pointing at that null. So this would be kind of a pain in the ass to pull off of just animating everything on the camera. And you could do it, but the benefit of this is we know that this is exact. It's going exactly back in space, and we get this perfect 80 or 90 degree arc, whatever we wanted to set it at, and we can create smooth camera motion. Number 3, cutting between multiple cameras in one composition. So we just built this nice camera on this null, but say we just want to have it cut to this one at this point. So let's say at 1 second 15, this is kind of our wide shot. And instead of that, we want a different camera that just kind of pulls close to the letters for a couple seconds. What we can do is have multiple cameras with all sorts of different properties in our shot and cut between them by changing the in and out point of our camera and keeping it on active camera. So if I change this to camera 1, it's always going to look from camera 1. But if I have it on active camera and stagger the in and out points, it's going to change that camera view as soon as it gets to that. So what I could do is have this one be our wide shot. And then I'm just going to make a new camera, layer, new camera, 15 again. And now for this one, let's say it's above the letters, close up, and just kind of rotating down. So it looks like there's a very clear cut and change. So what I can do is, again, I'll just pull this original camera out. So on this new camera, I could put it in a null, but I'll just press P and Shift A to get point of interest and position. And again, if I turn both of those on, and then I'll go ahead 2 seconds with Shift Page down, I can reposition and reorient the camera in my viewport, and it's going to update that. So now I have this little motion, and then I'm going to end that camera with Option right bracket for my out point on that keyframe. I can zoom in to make sure it cuts exactly. And then it's going to automatically cut because it's an active camera to the next camera. So if I pull this camera in, that's my B camera. Now I can cut from this camera to my wide shot. So now I have kind of slow rotation on the top of the text, and then we cut to our wide shot. And you could have more cameras. You could have different cameras with different focal lengths and different depth of field, and not have to worry about having different compositions and just cutting between different cameras while filming the same action. Number 4, creating roving keyframes for position. So everything that we've talked about so far is just a beginning and end point. There's only an A and a B point of this camera where it starts moving and then it ends. But camera motion can get a little more complicated. So say that I'll delete both of these cameras again, and I'll do layer, new camera. 15 is fine. Say that this is a more complex kind of crane motion idea. And we'll just do this with position and anchor. So I'll already break my own rules with trying to keep things clean with nulls. But say that this is kind of this long shot that starts here close to the letters. So at 0, I'll keyframe position and anchor point, and then press C to cycle through my camera shortcuts, pull back so we get to here. And it's important to note, if you're moving this around, it's only going to update keyframes if you change the position and point of interest. As you can see, it didn't make one, and I'm going to want to make sure I click that just in case I then make a third one and this isn't there. So say that I didn't do that and now I have this one. It's actually not going to save where that point of interest was because I didn't change it until that third keyframe. So again, if you just want to make sure that you're always getting what you see, make sure your keyframe position and point of interest, even if it doesn't add it itself. So anyway, we have position A and then position B, and then at 3 seconds, let's say camera kind of moves to the top a bit, and then at say 7 seconds, we get to our end motion. So what's going to happen is, first of all, since we have it swinging around and we're dealing with position now, we have position keyframes and by default Bezier curves. So this is our whole move, which we can adjust and shift around. And the speed that this happens, even though it's one continuous move, is impacted by where these keyframes are and the type of keyframes and easing that's on those. So if I just grab my camera and let's adjust these a little. So there's 4 points, but we really just want it to look like there's a beginning and an end position, and everything in between is going smoothly. And if I wanted the opposite, I can grab my convert vertex tool up here under the pen tool and click those, and it would delete all the curves. But I'll undo that because in this case I want it to be smooth camera motion, and I want the speed to be consistent. So right now, if I smooth out the motion and play this, we can see that our movement is smooth, but it looks kind of bumpy because something's happening weird between here and here. It's not going at a consistent rate of speed. So again, we just want it to look like there's the beginning position A and the end, and the movement and rate of speed is smooth throughout. So if we watch this again, it's going kind of quickly, and then right here when it gets to that keyframe, it kind of slows down, and we don't want that. We want it to look really smooth and cinematic, and then ease into the end. So first let's add this ease in at the end. And now since we have position A, B, C, and D on these keyframes, if we wanted the rate of speed to be consistent, we could try and find that ideal point and kind of shuffle the keyframes around and offset them. But there's this extra little keyframe option for exactly this sort of thing. When we have keyframes with sets of more than 2, and we want the rate of speed to be the same, if we right click, there's rove across time. And what this is going to do is take the keyframes in between the beginning and end and offset them automatically so the rate of speed is always consistent. So you can see that they change to these circles and kind of move themselves around. So now I still have my position A at the beginning and D at the end, but it's going to look like it's one smooth continuous thing if I play this. So now since it's offset those, you can see that the speed looks exactly consistent the whole time, because it is, and that's what it's doing. And the nice thing about this is it will auto adjust itself if you make this whole thing shorter or longer. So say that I like this whole animation and I like the position, but I just need the whole thing to happen faster. If I grab the end ones and bring them in, let's say it goes twice as fast. So right now it's 7 seconds. I want it 3.5. You can see that it's going to shift those roving keyframes to automatically adjust them to keep the speed consistent. So now if it's over 3.5 seconds and I play same camera move, but happening over half as much time with these auto adjusted. So it's a really helpful thing if you do want to go beyond just 2 positions and have a more complex camera move, but you're getting kind of tripped up with making it look smooth. And now when we're doing both of these and kind of adjusting time and rate of speed and position, we're getting into spatial and temporal interpolation. So we have where it's moving and the rate of speed. And you can also always adjust and reset these by grabbing keyframes. Let's say I grab all of them, right click keyframe interpolation. Our temporal interpolation, as it says, affects the rate of speed. So our eases and how smooth it's going. And it's just, since we made a bunch of changes, current settings, our spatial is our position. So I mentioned that little trick with resetting it with our convert vertex tool. We could also reset it here. Again, I'll grab all these, right click, keyframe interpolation. And if I just wanted to take off these roving keyframes and kind of have them go back to normal, if I do linear here, it's going to remove all of my eases. And then on these ones, again, keyframe interpolation, this last one, they're set to rove across time. If we change that to lock to time, it's going to keep where they are, but change that just to regular easing keyframes. And then if I wanted to adjust these back to no eases or anything, I can hold Command and click these, and they're back to diamonds. So it can be great when you get all this movement smoothly set up, but if things aren't going how you want it to and you just can't get it to work, it's good to know that you can always reset everything. Number 5, setting and linking depth of field. So here we are back with that same camera motion that we just built, and right now everything is in focus and we're not using depth of field at all. And besides our focal length, which is our millimeters, adjusting an aperture of a camera and playing with our plane of focus and depth of field is one of the most powerful things you can do with a camera as well as CG cameras to control where the eye is focused and what's in focus and out of focus in our shot. So by default, when I make a camera, enable depth of field is off. So I can turn that on here, or if I've already made a camera, on my camera, if I press AA twice, that's going to show my camera properties, and I can turn on depth of field. And how this works in cameras is the lower the f-stop, the more light that's going to be let in, and the smaller the plane of focus will be. But in After Effects, it's the same idea with an aperture, but it works inversely. So in After Effects, the numbers going to work the opposite of there's this meter of aperture, and essentially the more we turn that up, the tighter the plane of focus is going to be. Elements further away from that plane of focus will be more out of focus. And if I zoom out on my top here, after I enable depth of field, you can see that there's another line that kind of is sitting on the same spot, and that's our focus distance. So now if I turn aperture way up, let's say to 200, I can move my focus distance, and that's going to control where that plane of focus is. So this is what you would do in a real camera if you had different elements in a scene and you wanted to adjust the focus over time. You would adjust your focus distance. So say we want this text to be in focus and then it shifts to that one. We could move that by adjusting a focus ring and changing our focus distance. But one great thing about After Effects is since this is computers, we don't have to manually do that. There's a couple tricks when we have depth of field on and we want to control it. We can set it to a layer or link it to a layer, as well as animate it over time using those. And how that works is, let's just say in this first instance, we always wanted this text to be in focus. So the camera is moving around, but this text should always be in focus. If we grab our camera and one other 3D layer, so I'll command click to grab this animation text layer, I can right click and go to camera, and you can see there's link and set. So if I link this, what it's going to do is change focus distance to an expression. And if I twirl this down, it's written this really crazy expression that's saying always keep this object in focus. And if we look close, because our aperture is so high, parts of it are still out of focus. And it's important to note what it's linking isn't necessarily the entire layer. It's always going to be setting that exact point to the anchor point of this layer. So it has to pinpoint an exact pixel to always keep in focus, and it's pulling that from this anchor point. So if our plane of focus is actually tighter than one layer in this case, that's the one point that's always going to be 100% in focus. So now if I scrub through this, we can see that at different points, this is always in focus. And if I were to be moving or animating, say the position of this text around, we can see that this focus distance is automatically going to rewrite itself. But what if we don't want it to always follow one object? What if, say, we have an animation at the end that this starts in focus and then it racks our focus to this object. So this starts 100% in focus and it changes to this. What we can do is I'll just delete this whole expression, and that's going to undo that. Is the other option is if I grab a camera and command click to grab a layer, was right click camera set, and all this is going to do is change our focus distance but not set an expression on it. So it's just a one-time thing of changing this. So if I did it with the camera and command click and grab motion, right click camera set, it's going to change that focus distance to exactly the anchor point of that layer, but not change it over time. And what's cool is these are all animatable properties. So we can animate our focus distance and use that setting focus distance as a quick way to get a nice rack focus. So if I grab my camera and again, command click and right click camera set, now it's set the focus distance on this back layer. And you can see from the top, it's moved that plane of focus on my camera. Now if I animate focus distance, I'll turn my stopwatch on and just go ahead like 3 seconds. And then again, on my camera and command grab this other layer. So I'm grabbing animation, right click, camera, set. Now it's gonna set the front layer, but because this is a keyframing animating property, it makes a new keyframe, and then I have over time the focus shifting exactly from that back layer to exactly this front layer. And it's not as pronounced right now, but what we can always do is turn up our aperture, and that's going to throw the other elements more out of focus. So we can see this first keyframe, that word's 100% in focus. Everything else is really out of focus. And this last one, this foreground word is in focus. And these are just normal keyframes, so we can even ease in and ease out our shifting focus distance, which is great because if you're thinking about this in a practical camera, that's what you'd want to do. As you're shifting the focus around, you don't want it to look jarring to a viewer when it's done. You want to slowly ease that in. And by default, how it's calculating this focus is so that it renders quickly. It's set on this fast rectangle. And you can see it doesn't really accurately look like what out of focus elements would look like in a camera. What we can do is on this iris shape, change this. So right now it's fast rectangle. If we get to something like hexagon, heptagon, or octagon, it's going to take a lot more render time, but it's going to more accurately calculate that as a camera would. And since these are all moving now, we can have on motion blur on everything also. So there's tip number 6, I guess, but we won't make an extra graphic for it. And then have motion blur and depth of field on. So it is really important to note that motion blur and depth of field are two of the biggest render hits in computing graphics and camera animation, because with motion blur, we're calculating multiple instances of an object to make it blurry. And with depth of field, we're calculating multiple instances of objects to make them out of focus. So these are great things to use at the end, but they are big render hits, and it's something that sometimes you might want to have off while you're working. So if you're working on your camera animation, you don't need depth of field and motion blur on because it's going to really slow it down. But after you have your positions done, then start working on your focus distance and then turn on motion blur for final render. So there's a lot more you could do with cameras. There's many different settings and a lot of other great tips and uses. But with these 5 tips, this should get you started making some great camera animation in After Effects and really make a difference in your workflow by integrating these techniques. And if you're interested in this sort of thing for Cinema 4D, be sure to check out some of the camera videos and series I have on Cinema 4D camera animation, camera properties, camera rigs, and kind of everything you can do with cameras in Cinema 4D. And you can learn this whole thing for a full 3D program. But if you're just looking for tips on After Effects, this should get you a good start and get you making some nice camera animation. And if you want to check out more of my other tutorials, be sure to subscribe on YouTube at youtube.com/Sean Frangella, as well as check out the Facebook page and hit me up on at Sean Frangella if you want to ask questions about CG and 3D animation, request tutorials, and interact in the social network way. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you at the next video.